And now, Joseph Stiglitz argues that rising inequality in the U.S. is bad for our democracy and says that we need to become a more equitable society. This is just over an hour.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate so many people coming here, even though there's a little bit of discomfort. Well, as many of you may know, this book grew out of an article I wrote in Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair is not the usual medium for academic economists. But I did discover that it's read more than my articles in Econometrica. The title of that article summarizes a lot of about what I'm going to say, which is the title of that article was Of the 1%, By the 1%, and For the 1%. And it describes something of our polity and our economy. That article went viral. It's one of the advantages of the modern technology, and my publisher persuaded me to try to expand a 4-page article, and it got bigger and bigger. And the actual what I wrote was much bigger than that, and he disciplined me. What I want to do this evening is to try to describe the magnitude of the inequality in the United States, which I think most people haven't fully grasped. The causes of this inequality, the consequences, and I'm going to argue that it's actually very bad for our economy, but also very bad for our democracy. I'll talk a little bit about the way it manifests itself in almost every aspect of public decision, from budgets to macroeconomic policy. And then finally, I'll have a few words to say about what can be done about it, because I'm going to argue it's not inevitable, it's a consequence of the policies that we've adopted, and to try to say what could be done. Picking up on the remark that was made that one of the presidential candidates suggested that you shouldn't talk about these things in public. He also said it's all about the politics of envy. And I'm going to try to argue it's not about the politics of envy. It's really a debate about the justification and consequences of the level of inequality that inequality has reached in America today. One aspect is to say that most Americans don't realize is that America today has more inequality than any of the other advanced industrial countries. And that itself says something, because we like to think of inequality as having something to do with market forces. But market forces are there all over the world. What we do with our polity, what we do in government affects how the market forces operate. And the way that has happened in the United States has resulted in our having more inequality than any other society. And that should be a cause of reflection. Not only have we attained this high level of inequality, it's been growing. And it's been growing actually very rapidly. It used to be said that, watching inequality grow was like watching grass grow. It's very hard to see it happen. But in fact, what's been happening in the United States has been extraordinarily rapid. Since 1980, the share of the national income that goes to the top 1% has doubled from 10% to 20%. That means the upper 1% gets 1 out of 5 dollars. That's in terms of income, but in terms of wealth, the inequality is even greater. The top 1% gets about 40% of about 40% of all the wealth. However you slice it, inequality is growing. At the very, very top, the top 0.1%, their share of GDP has tripled since 1980. And if you look at what's happened more recently, say in 2010, in the recovery from the Great Recession, not a full recovery, they say not a real recovery, but what happened in that year, the top 1% got 93% of the growth of our economy. But even more disturbing in some ways is what is what's been happening to opportunity. Ryan, the head of the budget committee, said, "Oh, we're not interested in inequality outcomes. What we're interested in is opportunity." But unfortunately, that's not any better. The United States is the country with the least equality of opportunity of any of the advanced industrial countries for which there's data. And what does that mean? It means that the life chances of somebody born at the bottom are less, much less than those somebody born in the middle and the top, and that there is a higher correlation, a higher dependence on a child's prospects on the education and income of his parents than in any of the other advanced industrial countries. That should be very disturbing because we think of ourselves as a land of opportunity, and we all know examples of people who've made it from the bottom to the top, from the middle to the top. We all know examples of immigrants from poor backgrounds who've made it to the top. But when economists talk about opportunity, we don't mean these examples of these exceptions. What we mean is what happens on average? What are the life chances? And in that dimension, America is performing more poorly than any of the other advanced industrial countries. What is particularly concerned is what this bodes for the future of inequality in the United States, because if there is less equality of opportunity, it's more likely that in the future we will have even more inequality in a vicious circle that I'll come back to later. As I said, this level of inequality is not inevitable. Other countries have less inequality. We had less inequality in our past. Even the increase in inequality is not inevitable. The United States, say a decade or two ago, had even then the highest level of inequality, but our inequality has been increasing rapidly while others have managed to tame the increase of inequality, and a few countries have actually reversed it and brought down the degree of inequality. One example of that, of such a country, is Brazil. And one way of looking at what happened in Brazil, one interpretation, is that they looked over the precipice. They saw where they were going, the kind of divides in their society, people living in gated homes, a kind of political, social, economic turmoil, and they said, we can't go there. And they developed a cohesion of even the 1% saw that it was not in their interest for the continuation of their society to go in the direction that it was going. And then a president on the right, President Cardozo, not very far right, by American standards, probably on the left, President Cardozo said it was important for everybody to get an education, and he really pushed this. And then, of course, you all know about President Lula saying no child should go hungry. No child should go without vaccinations, and succeeded in actually doing a lot about the poverty in that country, so much so that it's already reflected in the data. You see the decline in inequality in a relatively short period of time. Now, those who defend this kind of inequality, and there are, as you know, many, although increasingly few, those who defend this level of inequality say, oh, as I say, it's the politics of envy. Everybody really benefits. And that's an idea called trickle-down economics. You throw enough money at the top, and somehow it trickles down, and eventually everybody benefits. I wish it were true, because if it were true, given the level of inequality we would have, everybody would be actually in pretty good shape. But if you look at the data, right now, most Americans, and let me repeat, most Americans are worse off than they were a decade and a half ago. In other words, incomes adjusted for inflation at the median, half above, half below, are lower than they were in 1997. And that's really striking. So the American economy has not been working for most Americans. It's been working very well for those at the upper 1% or 10%, but not for the majority of Americans. Another statistic that I find even more troubling is when you look, when you parse it out more finely, what you see is the extent to which some groups in our society have been doing particularly poorly. One group are males. That has a large fraction of our population, obviously. Male workers, a full-time male worker in the United States, his income, adjusted for inflation, median, people in the middle, is lower than it was in 1968, almost a half century ago. And if you want to understand some of the frustration, some of the alienation, it has a lot to do with people finally beginning to figure out that the American dream is not true. So the idea that you shouldn't complain because while the bottom may be getting, and the middle may be getting a smaller share, the pie is getting bigger, and therefore the size of the slice they're getting is bigger. That's just wrong. In fact, if you look historically, in the decades immediately after World War II, our economy grew much faster than it did in the period after 1980. And the period after World War II was a period in which we grew together. The people at the bottom, every group grew, but the people at the bottom grew more rapidly, and the people at the, as contrasted to the period after 1980, where the bottom and the middle have not done very well, but the people at the top have done very well. And this relationship between inequality and growth is not an accident, and I'm going to try to come to that later, that I believe that this inequality actually has been harming our economy. It's also the case that our views of inequality would be different if those at the very top receive their income because of their greater contribution that they made. The idea that those at the top receive their high income, a justification, has been part of economic theory for a very long time. Those of you who studied standard economics may remember the theory called marginal productivity theory. People's pay is related to their contribution. Well, that idea was totally undermined, in my judgment, by what happened in the Great Recession. You may remember that those bankers who brought the world's economy to the brink of ruin, who brought their own firm to the brink of ruin, so that their contribution either to their firm or to our society was unambiguously negative, walked off with very large bonuses. So how could you say that their pay was a result of their marginal productivity? I sometimes joke that sometimes, you make a sine error, and so they thought it was negatively correlated rather than positively correlated. But that's not what the theory really is supposed to say. In fact, some firms were so embarrassed by this lack of congruence between performance and pay that they decided to change the name from performance pay to retention bonus. But, of course, it raises the same question. Why do you want to retain somebody who brought you to the brink of ruin? So that, I think, is one of the reasons that there's such discontent. If you look at the people who've made the most important contributions to our societies, the people who... Turing, who did the mathematics behind the computer, the people who discovered the transistor, the laser. You can go down all the major innovations, DNA, that have transformed our society. None of them are in the top wealthiest people in our country or in the world. The people who wind up there have done something different. I'm going to come to that in a minute. I do want to say before coming to that there are many dimensions to America's inequality. It's not only that there's too much money at the top, But there's also been a hollowing out of the middle class. Their income, I mentioned, is lower, but it's also the fraction of the population that are in a range of that middle has been getting smaller, and the country is becoming more polarized. And a consequence of that is that there are a significantly larger fraction of the population that are in poverty today. One example of that brought home when I was in India not long ago, and on the front page, they had a big article about how 1 out of 7 Americans was on food stamps. And 1 out of 7 Americans, even though they were on food stamps, face food insecurity. That means they go to bed at least once a month hungry, not because they're on a diet, but because they can't afford food. And of course, the context, the Indians were finding this amazing. America is supposed to be this rich country, and yet here, even in America, there are so many people that can't afford food and remain hungry. Well, the recession has made all these problems worse. It's taken away, particularly in the area of wealth, it's had a devastating effect because Americans in the bottom and middle put most of their wealth in their homes. And when the house prices went down by 30%, in some places by 50%, they lost everything. And so that leads to the kinds of statistics such that the 6 members of the Walton family have a wealth that's equal to the bottom 30% of America. And that's a testimony to how rich the rich is, but it's also testimony to how poor the bottom is. And when you look at inequality, it manifests itself in every other dimension, in health, for instance, in life expectancy. If you happen to be poor, your life expectancy is markedly lower, especially in America because we don't have any commitment to providing health care for everyone. So let me now spend a few minutes, and I'm running out of time, explaining the sources of this inequality. And each part of the inequality, the increase in the top, the hollowing out in the middle, the increase in poverty, has their own explanations. And I'm going to spend most of my time, limited time, talking about the top. One of the arguments in the book is that a lot of income at the top is related to rank seeking. Those who are not economists, let me explain what ranks are. Ranks are the income you get not from working, not from effort, but from your ownership. Say it originated from landowners, they got rents. But now economists have generalized that. And the basic idea is a very simple one. The question is, are you making the pie bigger, that's creating wealth, or are you trying to get a bigger share of a given pie? And in the fight to get a bigger share of the given pie, you actually may make the pie smaller. And we're used to talking about the problem of rent seeking in oil countries and Russia. We describe these countries as rent seeking economies. But what most Americans don't realize is we've become, to a large extent, a rent seeking economy. So examples of rents that diminish the size of the pie are like monopoly. Monopoly, you get your profits by restraining output, but not by producing more, but by constricting output. And if you look at the people at the top, they include some monopolists. And not only my judgment of monopoly, it's what American courts have judged as monopoly. You can figure out what I'm talking about. Another kind of rank seeking, example of rank seeking, occurs as a result of our deficiencies in corporate governance. The CEOs of many of the corporations have been very successful in getting for themselves a larger share of the corporate pie. And this has increased enormously in the last 30 years. Much worse in the United States than in any other country. you cannot relate their pay to any higher level of productivity of American corporations. If you look at their pay, it's unrelated to their, as the example I gave in the financial sector illustrates. So, if you had somebody that worked for you, you would say you have the right to determine what their pay is. I mean, it's almost obvious. The managers of companies are supposed to work for the shareholders. But the managers fought tooth and nail to stop a simple provision that would say shareholders should have say in pay. Other countries like Australia have such legislation. But the CEOs in America said it would be the end of capitalism because they would be held accountable. And that's an example of rent seeking, getting a larger share of the pie. Market forces obviously do play a role in affecting the level of inequality that we have, but market forces don't exist in a vacuum, and the laws and regulations that we pass shape those market forces. And let me just give you two examples that illustrate that. Take our bankruptcy law. Our bankruptcy law in the United States gives first priority to derivatives, those risky securities that brought down AIG and required a bailout of $150 billion. We say those are the most important things in our society, more important than paying wages or anything else, derivatives. And of course, the consequence of that is that resources move into derivatives, making our economy more unstable. At the other extreme, in the bankruptcy law, we say that student debt cannot be discharged even in bankruptcy, even if the school does not deliver on the education they promised. In most areas, you say satisfaction guaranteed and your money back. But in this sphere, as those for-profit schools, many of them owned by Wall Street, have tried to exploit the least educating, sophisticated students, what they've said is you won't get your money back no matter what we give you, and your student loan will be an albatross around your neck for the rest of your life. In effect, what I argue in the book, we've reintroduced in the United States a kind of indentured servitude, partial indentured servitude. Another example that should be deeply disturbing is the way the financial sector has been very successful in moving in predatory lending and abusive credit card practice, a whole set of things of that kind, which effectively move money from the bottom to the top. So that helps explain the two extremes, why there's so much money at the top and why there's so little money at the bottom. And our legal framework gave them the scope to do that. So that's another set of explanations for the unusual level of inequality in the United States. The final set of explanations has to do with government munificence, that those at the top use their political influence to get more money out of the government. And it takes many forms. When I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, one of the tasks that I was given was to identify corporate welfare and try to do something about it. It's not so easy to identify the corporate welfare because an awful lot of it is buried in the tax code, not easy to find. But it was there, and it was very, very large. But unfortunately, while we could identify it after a lot of work, we couldn't do anything about it. In fact, in the subsequent years, it grew enormously. The largest act of corporate welfare, of course, was the bailout of the banks in the trillions of dollars. But in addition to this, there are a whole set of other open and largely hidden subsidies. An example of hidden subsidies is when the government pays more than market prices for what it buys. An example was in Medicare Part D, the drug benefit of Medicare. Very important program, but there was one sentence, and it shows you how you can, one sentence can make a big difference. One sentence that said the government, the largest purchaser of drugs, could not bargain with the drug companies. And the estimated cost of that one sentence is $500 billion over 10 years. Again, just a gift to the top. The other way, of course, is to sell public assets at below market prices. Again, a kind of giveaway. Another, minerals, when we sell minerals, we ask them to pay only a nominal amount, not anything related to the fair market value. So again, it's a giveaway that leads to more inequality. Well, these and the things I've described have contributed to making the U.S. the country with the most unequal before tax and transfer distribution of income. But what's also remarkable about the United States is that we do less to correct the inequality of market income. That is to say, we do less through progressive taxation and transfers to make our society more equal, even given the high level of inequality that we have. And things, again, have gotten worse. Most of you probably know about the most egregious example of that, and that is that the average tax rate of the top 1% is around 15%. Less, much less than those who earn a much lower income. And we all know at least one person who falls exactly in that category, not paying his fair share of taxes. The reason for this, of course, is that we have special provisions in the tax code for the taxation of capital gains. It's taxed at a much lower income than people who work for a living. But you think about, what is that doing? What that says is, if you make your money by speculating, buying CDSs, trying to bring down the Greek economy, cause turmoil in the world, you're going to be taxed at 15%. If you work hard and try to make an innovation and are successful, you'll be taxed at 35%. You can say, how does this reflect either our values or a system of economic efficiency? What it does reflect, of course, is politics. But before coming to that, I want to spend just a few minutes trying to explain why America's inequality is so bad for our economy and our growth. It's bad for our politics. It has a lot of adverse effects. But in the narrow sense, not looking at this from a moral point of view, just looking at it from an economic point of view, it's bad. The first reason is that this kind of inequality is associated with more instability. It's not, and a weaker economy. It's not an accident that the last time inequality reached a level that is comparable to what we have today was in 1929, right before the Great Depression. And the reason for this, let me try to explain it very, very quickly. The people at the top save a significant fraction of their income, 15, 20%. The people at the bottom can't. They spend all their money. So when you redistribute money from the bottom to the top, you reduce demand. Now, the response of the Fed ignored what was going on and said, oh, I know how to keep demand going. Let's create a bubble. Now, of course, they didn't say it quite that way. What they did is they got rid of regulations. They had a flood of liquidity, and that did create the bubble. But and it kept the economy going in spite of the fact of the low demand that was arising from the growing inequality. It worked, but only temporarily. And that was predictable, and it was predicted. And, of course, now we're dealing with the aftermath. But part of that aftermath is that we still have the degree of inequality, but we don't have the bubble. And that means that our economy is lacking effective demand, aggregate demand, and that means there's going to be high levels of unemployment persistently. Some of the other reasons that inequality is bad for our economy and for economic growth follow very much from the analysis of the sources of inequality. I talked about one of the sources of inequality is the extensive rent seeking. And as I said, the nature of rent seeking is that you're trying to get more money from others rather than adding to the wealth of the society. And so you're diverting resources to speculation, to trying to lobbying, to try to persuade Congress to give you a gift, rather than using it more productively. In fact, I mean, as a teacher at Columbia, and all when I talk to teachers at other universities, they feel this frustration. Their best students disproportionately went into finance. You know, in the older days, they would have gone into research, into public service, into medicine, into a whole variety of professions. But because of the magnitude of the lure of the money and investment banking, they disproportionately went into that area. And if a society is allocating all of its human capital in that area, there are going to be consequences. A third reason why, on average, societies with higher level of inequality don't do very well relates to the phenomena I described before, that America is the country with the least equality of opportunity. Now, what does that mean? That means people at the bottom are not living up to their potential. Their life prospects depend on their education, depends on the education and income of their parents. And that means a large fraction of Americans are not living up to their potential, and that obviously is weakening the economy. The final thing is, a strong economy requires heavy levels of public investment. Public investment in infrastructure, technology, education. But when you have a very divided society, it's very difficult to get support for that kind of public investment. Part of the reason is that the 1%, the people at the top, worry about too strong of a government, because they worry that the government might use its powers to redistribute, and they don't want that. And so they don't need the public parks, they don't need the public education, and so for them, government is a threat. And yet, in the long run, they're wrong. Because unless you make these investments, the overall economy is not going to perform well, and they won't do well. So there's one really important idea that comes out of this analysis, and that is, if you look at the old textbooks, they always talk about trade-offs. Trade-off, yes, inequality is a bad thing, they say, but to get less inequality will pay a price. The price we'll pay is lower growth, lower GDP. Okay? That's the story. So yes, there are trade-offs, and if you want more equality, you have to pay a price. What this analysis says, that we can have more equality and more growth, a more efficient economy. There's not a trade-off. In fact, that's inequality is really hurting our economy. That's the reason for the title, The Price of Inequality. Well, I've described the effects on our economy. I want to say a little bit about other aspects of our society, because I do think that the level of inequality that we've achieved is weakening our democracy. And there's a fundamental puzzle here. Those of you who've studied political science know that the standard theory says that in a democracy, the outcomes should reflect the median voter, the person that half want more public spending, half want less. If you look at what's the outcome of America democracy, it doesn't reflect the median. It's much closer to reflecting the views at the top. And that's a puzzle. And I try to analyze why that is, and two hypotheses. One of them is that there's been a process of disenfranchisement. We saw that in Florida. Disempowerment, and most importantly, disillusionment. Because if you have a politics that leads to outcomes that are the same no matter what happens, that is to say, the elite drive the legislation, no matter what party, it may make some difference, but they say, well, it doesn't make a lot of difference. and you get a disillusionment with democratic politics. And you saw that so clearly in the last election in 2010, where only 20% of the young people bothered to show up. And what they were saying is, politics isn't going to solve the problem. And that, I think, is extraordinarily difficult, extraordinarily bad for our democracy. The other partial reason for what's been going on has to do with advances in modern psychology, behavioral economics, marketing. Firms have learned how to sell products. For instance, they were able to sell the idea that cigarettes, that there was no credible evidence that cigarettes cause cancer, even though the cigarette companies had in their files the evidence that it did cause cancer. But they said this over and over again. They had a good advertising campaign, and an awful lot of people believed it. The point here is, if you can sell bad, dangerous products, you can also sell bad ideas. And those in the 1% have the tools today, the modern tools, they have the resources, they have the incentives to do exactly that. And you see that over and over again. Perceptions of the degree of inequality in the United States have been shaped by those who don't want Americans to realize how unequal we are. Equality of opportunity. You know, people say, well, we don't care about equality of outcome, we care about equality of opportunity, as if that's what we have, but we don't. So there's been a concerted effort to convince America that there isn't a problem when there clearly is. Well, let me, what I try to do in a series of chapters in the book is to show how these debates about inequality, the growing inequality affects every aspect of our society, of our politics. So just let me give 2 examples. We're used to thinking of our country as determined by a rule of law, justice for all. But what do you mean by a rule of law and justice for all? A rule of law is supposed to protect those at the bottom. Just to give you one example, think about what happened in the foreclosure crisis. We threw people out of their homes under the so-called rule of law who owed nothing. And of course, what is the bank's response? Well, their response is, well, most of the people who were thrown out of their homes did owe something. But a system of justice that says most of the people who get capital punishment were probably guilty is something that we should feel uncomfortable with. But that is the mindset of the banks. We've really undermined the rule of law. And if you look at other aspects of our system of justice, what we've evolved to is not justice for all, but justice for those who can afford it. As another example, in Washington, you're going through a battle of the budget. You might actually think that the battle of the budget was about the deficit, but it's not. It's about this issue of inequality. If it were about the deficit, the first place you begin is to remember 10 years ago we had a surplus. We had a surplus that was so large that Alan Greenspan said that unless we do something about it, we are going to pay back our total national debt, and he would not be able to conduct monetary policy. Now, when you think about it for a moment, you realize how specious that argument was. Assume, in fact, that those surpluses had continued, and in, say, 2015, we had almost paid back the national debt. I believe that he could have gone, or his successor could have gone to Congress and said, we face a national emergency. You have to spend more. And you have to have a deficit. I cannot believe that Congress and the administration couldn't figure out a way of spending more and getting the deficit up. And yet he made, with a straight face, that argument, and Congress passed a tax cut for the millionaires on the basis of that argument. Well, you go through the other things that happened between 2001 and today, and you realize, of course, that we converted this surplus into a very big deficit. And the obvious way to get rid of the deficit is to reverse what the 4 things, there are only 4 things that really led the change of our fiscal position between 2001 and 2011. That would go at least a very long way to correcting the deficit problem. But that kind of discussion is not on the agenda at all. What are they talking about? In a deficit reduction package that comes from Bowles-Simpson, they talk about capping the tax rate at the top. So really what is here is an agenda to reduce the degree to some extent. I don't want to make it too strong, but there is at least an element here of reducing the degree of distribution, progressivity in our economy, in our society. Well, the final chapter presents an agenda for reform, and you can see that it pretty well follows from the analysis of the sources of inequality of all the kinds, the top, the middle, and the bottom. I won't go through it because I want to open it up for question. But there is a difficult question. While it's easy to write down the economic reform agenda, I had 21 points, but my editor said you can't list 21 points in a book that anybody will buy. So it's there, but you'll have to figure it out as 21 points. But we know what the economics, we know what to do. The question is, where our politics allow it? And this is where, to get the economic reforms, we're going to have political reforms. And the political agenda, I think, is fairly well understood, although there's some aspects that I think that I try to call attention to that haven't gotten sufficient attention. But campaign finance reform, stopping the revolving doors, the role of lobbyists, and so forth. The difficulty is we're in a vicious circle. More economic inequality leads to more political inequality that leads to rules that make for more economic inequality. And the question is, how do you cut into that vicious circle? Well, I don't have any magic solution to that. I wish I did. And so that leads me to the final question, is there hope? Now, I'm of two minds about this, but I want to end on a little bit of an upbeat, because I was also told that people don't buy books if they're going to get depressed. And my book, The $3 Trillion War, it became a phrase, the $3 trillion war, but nobody wanted to buy it because it was too depressing. And it turned out to underestimate the cost of the war, and we can go into that later. But so let me end on an optimistic note with a realization that there is some skepticism about this optimism. Our country has been at high levels of inequality in other times. In the Gilded Age, in the Roaring '20s. And each of those times, we step back. We step back from the brink. In the Gilded Age, after the Gilded Age, we had the Progressive Era, where we passed antitrust laws to deal with monopoly, a whole set of legislation to make our society work better and more together. The New Deal, we know about the whole set of legislation in the 30s that made our economy work better and our society come together. So hopefully what I hope is that Americans will realize where we are, what the consequences are, what the price that we are paying for inequality, and what the price we will pay for inequality if we allow it to continue, that they'll step back from the brink and do something about what is clearly one of our most pressing problems. Thank you.
That was absolutely spectacular.
That's a good way to start. Let me just stop there before.
And I've been a fan for a long time. I have two quick questions. One of them is a leveraged buyout a rent-seeking activity, particularly when the money that comes out of the company and the real economy goes into the financial economy and stays there and is traded back and forth? And should we ban them? And the second thing is, it's the what's the matter with Kansas problem. It's why do working class and lower middle class people, the people who are being squeezed the most by this economy, why do they vote Republican? And you suggested that it had something to do with the advertising and the understanding, and that's true. Could it also have to do with the fact that there's no leadership on our side? That we don't have an FDR, that we can't even say the word liberal.
Okay, so let me first ask a question about leveraged buyouts. You know, companies need to be restructured at times, and the activity of restructuring companies that are not working well is important. But a lot of the leveraged buyouts, that's not about restructuring. It's about taking money out of the company, a short-sighted activity that then leaves the company incapable, in worse shape. And as all of you may know, a lot of the companies that get restructured, money gets taken out, go bankrupt a couple years later. So there's not the fundamental kind of restructuring that is an important part of the task. I don't think leadership provides all the explanation because, after all, if you look at the Republican Party, I don't see any leadership there either. So that by itself is not a convincing argument. There are some other theories about their ability to exploit social issues that do play a role. But I think, to me, the explanations that I focus on in the book are probably the two most persuasive ones.
Thank you.
I'm a retired professor of mathematics, and I just realized, listening to your talk, that my biggest failure in life is that I was never important enough to be a capitalist crony. On a more serious note, you talk about instability. I was reminded of Aristotle's Politics, where somewhere he says, when the few have too much and the many have too little, troubles arise and the state soon comes to an end. So 2,500 years ago, Aristotle recognized the extremes of the terrible consequences of the extremes in inequality that you mentioned, but you didn't emphasize the political instability that will result from this economy.
No, let me say, I tried. I only had half an hour and I overran that time, so I couldn't talk about. But the political instability is one of the real risks. When I say that our democracy is at peril, you see what is going on as a result of the malperformance of the economies in Europe, the rise of extreme groups, the neo-fascist, and that's the kind of political instability that can arise. I should also say about social instability or social problems. In those countries that have, in which these kinds of high levels of inequality have persisted, you find that 1% living in gated communities, separated from everybody else. They're in a kind of prison, but the real point is that the different communities live totally apart, different lives, and it really undermines the notion of a community.
You use the motto, "Another world is possible." And that's also the motto for a coalition that was formed out of Seattle during the World WTO protests. It's called Our World Is Not for Sale. And that coalition has worked very hard to try and turn around the trade agreements that really are harmful to the kinds of issues that you're talking about here. And it's very, very difficult. The negotiations go underground and you can't even get the documents now. So my question is, what would you do to begin to really mobilize people? It's like we have a supersaturated solution right now, but what would you do to begin to mobilize people to begin to really make a change?
So on the particular issue that you discussed, the trade agreements, I think one of the points is exactly the point you made, that many of these trade agreements are negotiated in secrecy. right now, many of us want to know what's going on in the partnership agreements with Asia that we're talking about. No one really knows. And the result of this is that at the end, they'll be presented with a document and they'll say, oh, we've already negotiated. You can't change it now. So I think one of the real demands ought to be more transparency. And that is at least, we may disagree about, people may disagree what the contents are. I do believe with greater transparency, people will say, this is not acceptable. This doesn't reflect our values.
I do want to just make the point that the corporations do know what's in those agreements.
Oh, they know, but the rest of us don't, and that's the concern.
I was lucky enough to hear you on the radio a couple days ago, and so I've had 2 days to think about this. You said the stockholders had more control over CEO salaries until about 1980. Or correct me and then
No, what basically happened was we didn't change our corporate governance laws, but there used to be a kind of social consensus, a kind of self-discipline that the CEO said it is wrong for us to take a salary that's 1,000 times that of our average worker. In Japan, the norm was 10. In Europe, it's maybe 30. And the United States just went out of bounds. So you might call it the social contract disappeared in the United States. And then because we had no corporate governance laws like Australia had, there was nothing to restrain. And finally, the breaking of the air traffic control strike weakened unions, which had served as a partial constraint. And then we got in the situation where the company would say, we have to pay you low wages because we don't have the revenue. And the reason we don't have the revenue is because we're paying myself this $400 million salary. So, and they said that again with a straight face.
do you have any ideas? I'll bet a few people here are stockholders of some companies.
Well, there is a movement for shareholder activism, and what's really striking in Europe, it's actually working. People are voting down the exorbitant pay of a lot of CEOs. And the interesting thing is, what they call exorbitant is minuscule compared to American exorbitant CEO pay.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Hi, it's a pleasure to finally meet the face behind all those bylines on the academic papers I didn't read in college. We've talked a lot about the grand strategy, but I'd like to bring it a little bit more personal. Myself and my friends, about 1 year, 2 years out of college, find ourselves in an interesting limbo land where we're too experienced to get any internships and not experienced enough to get any jobs. And we've noticed that there's a seeming inequality within the internship world itself, whereas those who have wealthy parents and can afford to take an unpaid internship at a very prestigious institution can afford to go somewhere, and those that can't end up waitressing or something. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but they don't have the opportunities. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on unpaid internships. Yeah,
you're absolutely right, and I actually talk about that in the book because it is one of the mechanisms by which inequality gets perpetuated. The question is, why is it the United States has become the country with the least equality of opportunity, the highest correlation between parental income and the child's income? And that's one of the mechanisms by which we perpetuate inequality. And obviously, it's also can be a form of exploitation as well. There's some actually interesting books that have come out on that.
I'll just have to buy your book. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, sir, for coming. I'm sort of in the same situation that he is. I'm a recent college graduate as well. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the Occupy movement. I was down there the other night, and it was a rather sad sight. Only a few tents there. The park pretty much trashed. The restaurants around there talking to the newspaper saying how glad they were that Occupy was gone, they could have normal business again. And then I see the Tea Party and I see the Republicans pretty much going to the Tea Party, and the Tea Party pretty much starting to take over the Republicans. And I don't see that with the Occupy and the Democrats. So where would you say that Occupy went wrong in that regard?
Okay. Well, first, those of young people who don't have a job, I don't know if this is going to make you feel better, but if you were in Spain, there's a 50%, more than 50% unemployment rate, and there's no prospects of things getting better. So you might say, relatively, you're better off, but that should not be a good answer. I think the reason this is a difficult year for movements like Occupy Wall Street because it's a political season. And what the Tea Party did is linked itself with a political party, with the Republican Party, and try to take over the Republican Party. And I think there hasn't been that kind of link between the protesters, the Occupy Wall, and an attempt to have their voice heard more strongly within the Democratic Party. So at least that's at least one possible explanation. Let me just say one more thing about the Occupy Wall Street movement in Spain. It was called the Indignados, and I spent last year. I went to Tunisia. I went to Cairo. So I talked to all of these protesters. I talked to the Indignados in Retiro Park, and they had a common theme in all of these, and that is that markets weren't working the way they were supposed to. Markets, when they're functioning, they're supposed to be able to get a job. Their demand is supposed to equal supply. That's the basic law of economics. And part of demand equals supply is in the labor market. And clear that the labor market isn't obeying the basic law of demand equal supply. Moreover, if you look at our economy, we have underutilized resources and huge unmet needs. So again, something is wrong. They're also articulating the view that the politics hasn't fixed it. And finally, they're articulating the view that's really very much consistent with this book, that something's unfair about what's going on. So the politics hasn't worked, there's an inequity, and there's an inefficiency. The difficulty is they didn't have an agenda of trying to fix it. They articulated what was wrong. They didn't have an agenda. The Tea Party movement has a simplistic solution which will make things worse and be worse even for their self-interest. And that's, I think that's, eventually I think they'll figure that out, but it may be a very painful process, not only for them, but for our whole country.
Thank you. I think we have time for 4 more questions.
Hi, I'm a college student and an unpaid intern, by the way. My question is, how do we lure these talented people away from the financial world and into the worlds of innovation and policy? If you're proposing to abolish rent sinking, I kind of feel like that's devaluing ideas and discovery. So how do you convince a culture?
No, discovery is not rent-seeking. It's just the opposite of rent-seeking. Discovery is really creating value by creating something that makes the size of the pie bigger. That's the major distinction. One way of redirecting resources is more progressive taxation. When you have rents, the good thing is if you tax rents, it discourages rent-seeking. So if a lot of the income at the top is rents, you make it less attractive to go into rent-seeking activities. It's not an accident, I think, that the lowering of the tax rate at the top has led to more inequality in the before-tax income because it provided more incentives for people to engage in rent-seeking. So there's a interaction between our tax structure and our before-tax income distribution of income.
Thank you.
Okay.
Testing.
We have time for 3 more questions.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I didn't get to read your things when I was an economics major. You had not written your first book yet. I have one question, but it's a little bit involved. And it's not about inequality, but you're the right person to ask the question of. If economics is a science, why are there competing economic theories with different answers to the same questions? Or do the different theories have different economic goals? And if so, why and what are they? Or have the theories of Adam Smith, F.A. Hayek, and Milton Friedman been misrepresented to us by politicians with an agenda?
Well, it's a good question. Let me. The problem of the difficulty with economics is it should be a science, but the pronouncements of the economic analysis has political consequences. And that means there are strong incentives for formulating ideas that support your political perspectives. So let me try to give examples of what I'm talking about. In my own research on asymmetries of information, all that means is the information is imperfect. Some people know more, something that other people don't know. What we showed was that the reason that Adam Smith's invisible hand was invisible was that it wasn't there. That is to say, that it was not the case that the pursuit of self-interest leads inexorably to the well-being of everybody. You know, the bankers pursued their self-interest, and I don't think any of us would say it led to the well-being of all of us. So that theory has been totally discredited as a theory. But if you listen to Milton Friedman and his disciples, you would not believe that there was this research that is taught in all the graduate schools, accepted everywhere, but they have a political agenda. They want to ignore these results. Now, of course, what they try to say is, oh, yes, this is a little picadillo, imperfect information, but we're almost with perfect information. And that was why when I did my research, one of the things I showed is that even a little bit of imperfect information changed the results in a dramatic way. There was a discontinuity. Again, they don't want to pay any attention to that. So my answer is the reason why you hear different theories, to a large extent, not completely, is that there is a political agenda on some of these theories. Now, there are some other cases where there's ambiguous empirical evidence. The world is complicated and we have to interpret the world. And let me give you an example of, very briefly, of where there ought to be unanimity, but there is controversy, and I'll try to explain what. And that is, there's a big debate about the role of austerity. Now, there has not been a single large economy that has ever recovered through austerity. Not a single one. Now, those on the other side have identified a few instances where governments cut back and the economy grew. Those were all small economies, and if you look at what happened, it was very simple. They were lucky. They were lucky because their trading partners were going into a boom. And so as their government spending went down, the gap was filled, more than filled, by exports. So there are some circumstances, and you could even manage it, to increase your export if you're a small economy, especially if you have flexible exchange rates. But we're not a small economy, and our trading partners are really not in good shape. So there is no way that we can hope to grow through austerity. There is no way that Europe can hope to grow through austerity. There have been experiment after experiment. You might say, call it an experiment. They're real-life experiments. The first one, recent history, of course, was Herbert Hoover. And he tried austerity, converted the stock market crash into the Great Depression. I don't know why anybody wants to try that again, but there are some Republicans who want to do that. But then if we didn't have enough evidence, the IMF did some more experiments on some involuntary patients. And it had austerity in Indonesia, Korea, Thailand, Argentina. And in each of these instances, it was a disaster. Downturns were converted into recessions, recessions into depressions. Not one of them worked. So I think, so that's an instance where people can say, oh, yes, you haven't looked at the data. There are successes. But when you look at the data more carefully, you realize there are none.
So you need to speak to Paul Ryan.
I hope he listens.
Good evening. Thank you for your terrific presentation. I look forward to reading your book. As an Irish national, I can directly relate to what happens when the majority of the population shifts from productivity to rent-seeking, which is exactly what Ireland is now trying to recover from. I have two questions for you. The first one, would you care to comment on the loss of manufacturing base in the United States, the rise of China, India, and other economies as to what the impact is on the price of inequality? And secondly, would you like to close this evening by letting us know whose policies, Obama's or Romney's, are going to be better for curing the price of inequality?
Okay. The first question is not easy to fully answer. The role of globalization in this whole process. Let me say that 30 years ago, we could have kept manufacturing more in the United States, but we decided to let it go. We decided not to have any industrial policy, as it's called, no strategy. And once you let it go, you start losing your, what we call, dynamic comparative advantage. You become less competitive. They learn, we don't learn. They develop institutions. You take a look, Germany, you mentioned Asia, but Germany maintained their industrial capacity, but they have good education oriented around it. They have a set of financial institutions. They have what they call the Mittelstand, a set of entrepreneurs that are focused on them. So they've managed to maintain it, but we've lost it, and it will be very difficult to recover. For those who, but let me also say, even if we were able to do a little bit in recovering, we have to realize that manufacturing is a little bit like agriculture 100 years ago. We are the victim of our own success. Increases in productivity in agriculture meant that we went from a world in which more than 60% of people were on farmers to a world where 2% of the population grows more food than even an obese population can consume. Manufacturing has been in the same light. We've been increasing productivity. We're getting, and the result of that, manufacturing jobs in China are going down dramatically. So we are getting a smaller share of a declining employment, and that's why we have to restructure our economy. Now, your second question is really an easy one. The fact is that one of the candidates simply doesn't understand inequality and doesn't want to talk about it. He says you should only talk about it in the hidden rooms. It's the politics of envy. The other one has finally come out and realized there is an important part. This is a key problem for America. And reflecting that, I mentioned before that Romney is only paying 15% taxes. Warren Buffett is also paying 15% taxes, but what Warren Buffett said, it's wrong. And he's come out with a lot of other billionaires and said it is wrong for him to pay a lower tax than his secretary. I have not heard that statement from Romney. He evidently thinks it's right. And that's very disturbing to me. Disturbing both about the likely policies that they would pursue and about a sense of moral compass about what are the right direction for our society.